Hello friends, in previous video tutorial we had talked about the few basically best practices about exception handling in Java. In this video tutorial we will continue with the same. So, we will see next few basically best practices with respect to exception handling in Java. So, next best practice says we do not suppress exceptions. The whole idea of having a checked exception in Java is to give a chance to take some action to recover from the raised exception, right? So, ignoring it by having empty braces in the catch block or just printing the stack trace or logging a checked exception and continue with the code is not a best practice, right? So, here you can see in the code snippet you have a try block and you have a number of lines of code within the try block and you have a catch, but catch block we have left the completely empty, right? So, we should properly we should log this information, exception informations somewhere in the basically by using the some kind of logging framework in the catch block. We should not leave empty catch block, right? So, now second, here you can see again we have a try block and here basically when exception arises, then simply we have a logger dot info and saying that some exception occurred, but we haven't basically logged this exception into the log file, and we are basically not throwing any kind of basically useful information so that the caller of our method will not come to know what went wrong behind the scene, right? So, we should basically we can, if you are working on the development phase, then you can print the stack trace or you can print entire exception into the log file, so that later point of time production support guys go and they can check in the log file what went wrong, right? So, simply printing some exception occurred, right, is not meaningful, right? So, we should always avoid empty catch block that just consumes the exception and does not provide any meaningful details of exception for debugging purposes, right? So, this is also a best practice. Now, next best practice we have a don't lose the original exception. Almost all the exception classes provide a constructor with the cause as parameter, right? And like if you go to the exception class, then you have a one of the constructor which takes error message or exception message, and second parameter cause, that is nothing but the reference of throwable, right? Always use the constructor with the cause parameter to keep the original exception. Like if some exception is thrown and you want to wrap it in the custom exception, right, then this is useful, right? Now, here you can see you have something kind of try catch block, and in catch block you have a illegal argument exception, and here we are throwing my custom exception and saying that exception caught and e dot message, right? This is completely incorrect way to basically throw some exception, right? So, what is the correct way? This basically what will happen, this will destroy the stack trace of the original exception and is always wrong. The correct way of doing this is something like this. We will have to do my custom exception caught and entire exp will have to basically throw, so that basically when exception will be propagated on the call stack, then calling method will get the entire information, right, whichever is stored in the this exp, right. So, second, this is the way to basically correctly handle the exception, right. Now, next basically best practices will talk custom exception as checked exception or unchecked exception, right. So, this is very important from the point of interview as well. Interviewer sometimes ask you, I mean, what kind of exception we should create as a custom exception, whether that is a checked or unchecked. Then one of the key points always you will have to keep in mind to decide whether you have to create the checked exception or unchecked custom exception, right. So, this is the key point. If user can take some action to recover from the expected error, then make the custom exception as checked exception, right. On the other hand, if user cannot do anything useful in case of error, then make the custom exception as the unchecked exception. This is pretty straightforward example, like inheriting from the runtime exception. Most of the time only function of custom exception is to log an error. In that case, it should definitely be the unchecked exception. Means you can create an exception by extending a runtime class or sub, and whatever class whatever subclass of runtime you can extend by that as well, right? Now next standard practice, you have a follow naming convention for exceptions. When creating your own exception, own custom exception, follow the already established naming convention for exception classes, like always and the class name with exception, like no such method exception, my app exception, right? So if you look into the basically existing custom classes within the JDK, you have a arithmetic exception, file not found exception, right? Always these classes basically end with the exception. So we should follow the same naming convention. Also try to keep the name try to keep the same type of exception in the same hierarchy, like IO exception is the basically base class exception for all the IO related exceptions, right? These are the things we should keep in mind when you create your own exception, right? Now next point, next important point, best practices, we have a Java exception performance consideration, right? So when you do kind of exception handling in your program, then always we should consider performance consideration as well. So exception basically exception have an impact on the overall performance of the application. So use them judiciously, right? Don't just throw and catch exceptions. If you can use boolean variable to indicate whether an operation was successful or not, they basically they try to return a boolean variable to a caller program and decide the flow of the code based on the return boolean, right? So unnecessary creating an exception object and throwing it, definitely this will basically degrade the performance of your application. So if sometimes if you call a method, right, instead of basically propagating some exception, basically called method can return some kind of boolean value, and calling method based on that boolean value can take some action or throw some exception. That would be the better choice. Now next standard practice says that document the exceptions thrown. So use Java doc like add throws to clearly specify the exceptions thrown by the method. It's very helpful when you are providing an interface to other application to use. So if you look into the within the JDK, all the APIs basically uses this Java doc annotation like add throws, and that basically explains about the all the exception which is thrown by the API, right? So that's all standard practice we wanted to discuss in this video tutorial. So in next video tutorial, I'll talk about some of the few more best practices with respect to the exception handling in Java. So guys, big thank you for watching this video, and see you in next video tutorial.